My name is Jack Knott, and I'm the Dean of the Sol Price School of Public Policy here at USC. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to USC, as well as to welcome you to this important lecture series. You know, it was in 2013 that the Price School and the Fred W. Smith National Library partnered to launch the George Washington Leadership Lecture Series. And these events explore President Washington's lifelong accomplishments, providing a better understanding of him as a person, but also a better understanding of his remarkable leadership, professional achievements, and of course his lasting legacy. We've designed this series to be bi-coastal, and in the fall we had the honor of convening at Mount Vernon, where we held an event there last fall, and we're pleased to bring the conversation here to sunny Southern California, and I'm sure all of you who are from the East Coast appreciate that in particular, and I'm glad you were able to make it despite the snowstorm this past weekend. And this collaboration was made possible by the generous support of Mary Beth and Hal Borthwick. And Mary Beth is a distinguished USC alumna, and she serves as the Vice Regent from California of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Mary Beth and Hal are both in attendance this evening, and I would ask them to please stand and let's recognize them for their generous contribution. We're also very excited to have our partners from the Fred W. Smith National Library, including President and CEO Kurt Viebrantz here as well. And I'd ask Kurt to stand and please recognize him also. Some of you may not be fully familiar with the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, and so I just wanted to quickly say a few words about our school before we begin. We were established more than 85 years ago, and USC Price is therefore one of the oldest and highest ranked public policy schools in the nation. We're also an interdisciplinary policy school with academic programs in public administration, in nonprofit leadership and management, public policy, as well as urban planning and real estate development. And our mission is to improve the quality of life for people and their communities everywhere. That's our basic, simple mission. And we accomplish that mission through education and research programs that focus on some of the most pressing policy issues facing the nation and on planning and developing better communities for the future. We strive to be a positive impact in the world, and we are guided by a strong sense of ethics and core values, which we seek to instill in our students. And we prepare our students to be the next generation of leaders, not only in the public sector, but also in the nonprofit and private sector as well. And we're committed to fostering economically dynamic, sustainable urban areas that offer opportunity, growth, equity, and a sense of community across the country. So in weaving together these interrelated disciplines and by reaching across the public, private, nonprofit sectors, we really feel that the Price School is uniquely positioned to analyze some of the most important policy issues facing the country and the world, as well as discovering new opportunities. And interestingly, in a variety of ways, George Washington's work aligns closely with the disciplines in the Price School. He contributed to shaping the fields in which our faculty conduct research and that our students pursue their careers. He was a government leader. He was a military commander. He was also a surveyor and urban planner of Washington, D.C. What you may not know, he was also a real estate developer and speculator in Ohio, and an innovator in disease prevention and health care practices at Valley Forge. So he really covers the gamut of the kind of fields that are in our school. And so together with the Fred W. Smith National Library, we are committed to advancing the study of George Washington. So this evening, we focus on a very critical policy issue That was important then and is taken center stage today as well, and that issue is immigration. This also happens to be one of the school's signature areas. We examine immigration from different lenses. For example, we study immigration policy and its effect on families. We also study the changing demography of immigrants and its implications for the future. And we look at the economic impact of immigrant entrepreneurs. In fact, the New York Times recently published an op-ed on immigration reform penned by Price professor Roberto Suro, who is also the director of our Tomas Rivera Policy Institute. And while current candidates, as you know, are engaging in pretty raucous debate over immigration, this issue is not new. When George Washington held the presidential office, the country grappled with immigration and naturalization policies. Just as we do today, they were concerned with the challenges of balancing inclusiveness, economic growth, social justice, and national security. So this was a topic at our founding, and it's a topic that we still debate today. And in our conversation tonight, we have the unique opportunity to learn about immigration from a historical perspective, which if you listen to the political debate, you don't hear about at all, as well as to delve into the current controversies. And leading our talk are two noted scholars, Dr. Douglas Bradburn, founding director of the Washington Library, and USC Dornsife College professor and Vice Dean Dr. George Sanchez, one of the nation's foremost historians. So at this time, before we get into our program, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce the president and CEO of the Fred W. Smith National Library, Kurt Wiebrants, who will say a few words. You know, Kurt is a remarkable individual. He's a businessman, entrepreneur. He has also a passion for American history and a long-standing commitment to community service. That is quite a combination. His very impressive professional career includes serving as president of HBO International and the first president of Time Inc. Multimedia. He was also involved in the management of several media-related startups, including Olay Communications, A&E, E! Entertainment, and so forth, and I think including AOL as well. In addition to his business experience, Kurt has held leadership roles in a wide range of cultural and civic causes. He's active with the Boys and Girls Clubs, and he's a longtime member of the Meserve Kuhnhart Foundation, which boasts one of the most amazing archives of Civil War photographs. And he has been served as the president of Middlebury College Alumni Association and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So quite an amazing, remarkable background, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming Kurt Wiebrants.
Thank you, Dean Knott, for that very solicitous introduction. As you have surmised, leaving 20 inches of snow in Washington, D.C. to make our way west has been very agreeable for myself and my colleague. You will get a chance to hear from Doug Bradburn. Also here is Donna Gray. Donna, just wave your hand, who is on our development staff. And so we're just delighted to be here. Doug and I had an incredible tour of the campus today, one I'd never had, by a senior who was about the best ambassador for any institution I've ever seen. And he took us all over the place, and so we are really grateful for the Western hospitality. So thank you very much. Thank you also to Mary Beth and Hal Borthwick. I was telling Jack today, Mary Beth, that the only detractor to our relationship is that you are this far away. So it doesn't mean, I don't see enough of you, but you have been an incredible supporter of mine and of the institution. So I'm grateful for that. If you'll rewind with me very quickly to December 14, 1799, Washington's death, a scant 50 years later, a woman, Louise Bird Cunningham, was making her way on a steamer down the Potomac to South Carolina and looked up on a moonlit night to see that the mansion was in complete disrepair, the home of the father of our country. And in fact, it was the custom of the steamship captain to ring the bell to honor the father of our country. And she was so appalled by the state of disrepair that she induced her daughter, Anne Pamela Cunningham, to form the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. The home was owned by John Augustine Washington. He was the last Washington relative to live in the house. He was trying desperately to sell it to either the federal government or to the Commonwealth of Virginia. Neither of them wanted any part of it. And in fact, Louisa Bird Cunningham said to her daughter, Anne Pamela Cunningham, if the men of America can't save the home of the father of our country, then the women shall. So in 1853, Anne Pamela Cunningham formed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, and over the next 5 or 6 years, she had the daunting task of fulfilling two things. She first had to raise $200,000 to acquire the home from John Augustine Washington, and she had to convince John Augustine Washington to sell her the home. And she was successful by 1859, and the last sort of linchpin of the deal was they had to agree, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, that if they couldn't make ends meet and keep the home up, that it would go to the Commonwealth of Virginia, which if we sort of fast forward then to today, it's pretty remarkable that that was a problem. They thought could be a problem because, of course, they opened the home in 1860. We've had more than 85 million people visit Mount Vernon since then. We have 1 million people a year come there. It is the most visited historic home in America. We have done remarkable things with our digital efforts, our outreach since 2012. We have grown our traffic by fourfold, from 1 million to nearly over 4 million visitors. We've had 2 royal visits in the last year, one by the Prince of Wales. The first time in the history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association we've had 2 royal visits. And the remarkable thing about this is that we've done it all without taking a nickel of government money. So yeah, that always gets an applause. It's really, doesn't matter the audience, doesn't matter the place, that always gets an applause. And so for me, it's really a remarkable story about visionary women who stuck to it through thick and thin, and that's where we end up today. Our mission is, I think, very simple. We are trying to preserve the home of George Washington, and we're trying to educate people around the world on the life and lessons of the man. We spend a lot of time thinking about the historical context of the, the current things going on. And of course, this would be a moment with the election, it being an election year, when Washington's name may be bandied about more than normal. You may have seen he's on the cover of New Yorker magazine, this latest issue, and he's there with FDR and Teddy Roosevelt and with JFK and with Abraham Lincoln, and they're looking at a television screen, and Washington has his hands over his eyes, and there is a particular candidate speaking on TV, and then I also read today that Glenn Beck, apparently seeking a higher power over the weekend, announced that he now knows the candidate that is the next George Washington. So that's big news, but here's a spoiler alert. In my humble opinion, the next George Washington is not among the candidates that are going to be standing for election. So I've come a long way. Just give me a minute and a half to tell you why I say that. He was a man of great integrity and the utmost civility. He was a man of action. I think really that the reason he got so much done was because he didn't really want to be in government. He wanted to be back at Mount Vernon, and he selected himself as a farmer. He showed repeated willingness to give up power in the creation of a new republic, underpinned by popular sovereignty. And here then is really, for all of you here, the good news. If you're scratching your heads about where this is all going to end up in the next 11 months, on January 20th, 2017, we will inaugurate the 45th President of the United States of America. And for that, we really have Washington to thank, because he, of course, led us to independence. He presided over the Constitutional Convention. He then created the executive branch of our government from whole cloth over 2 terms, and he had the prescience and the wisdom to give up office after 2 terms and pass it by orderly progression to John Adams as the second president of the United States. And those things are remarkable when you sort of think back on what might have happened. And I can tell you that without George Washington, we would not be sitting here today as a free republic. And so I borrow from my good friend Joe Ellis, the historian, who, when he spoke recently in Mount Vernon, took out the dollar bill. And he said at the end of his lecture, as you now, all of you go out to the world and you are trading in U.S. currency, and you have, it's a crisp one, I got a crisp one for this. As you are trading in the currency, I want you to look at Washington and really realize that he was indeed the indispensable man, and that man whose inestimable contributions have made this country what it is. So thank you very much.
Well, that was great. I'm learned so much about George Washington over the past couple of years because of this partnership, and always so incredibly impressed. I did want to mention that, given the Ladies Association, that our Dean Speaker Series for this year is focused around the theme of women in leadership. And we have some great panels on that, both for government leadership, but also business leadership. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, USC Professor Dr. David Sloan. David is a leading expert and prominent scholar in American urban history, urban planning, public policy, and community health planning. He is the former director of our urban planning graduate programs and recently directed our undergraduate program, which is the largest single degree program in the school. And under his leadership, the undergraduate curriculum was greatly revised and improved to better prepare students both for careers and for graduate study. He's a remarkable scholar. He's somebody who is also great with students. He's a wonderful colleague, and he's our primary liaison to the George Washington Library at Mount Vernon, an ideal role given his expertise and background. So please welcome Professor David Sloan.
Good evening. Jack is tall. I'm surrounded by tall people when I go to faculty meetings. We have 6'5", 6'6", 6'4", 6'4", and he's, as he said, for the people in the back, he's the same height as George Washington. Welcome to this evening's presentations. It's going to be really fun, I think. One of the great things about the lecture series has been our wonderful partnership with the people from Mount Vernon and the Fred W. Smith National Library. And one of the things they've allowed us to do is to think about Washington from a variety of perspectives. So many of us, when we think of Washington, think about the military service, something that we did last October with General Petraeus, and we don't think about immigration in the early American period. Yet, all of us grew up from the time we were in elementary school being told that we're a nation of immigrants. Well, that didn't just begin last week. It didn't begin in 1890. It began with the beginning of the new nation. Tonight we have 2 outstanding historians to talk to us about very different aspects of this, perspectives of this. First, we're going to hear from Doug Bradburn, who I will introduce just in a second, who will talk about Washington's time and Washington himself. And then George Sanchez, my colleague, our colleague here at USC, is going to take us through a discussion up until the 20th century, up until today. I don't quite know if he'll make it to today. I wouldn't if I was him, but up to him. I'm an historian at heart, and I always get a little nervous when we get close to the present. And then I hang around with these public policy people who want me to talk about the future, and I'm like, the future? Let's talk about dead people. They're more fun. Anyways, it's going to be, I think, a lovely time and I think an educational time for us to think about what it means, immigration historically, and how it influences how we think about immigration today. Our first speaker is indeed Doug Bradburn, the founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. Dr. Bradburn is a really great scholar, and if you're interested in the early American period, I would encourage you to look at his book, Citizenship Revolution, Politics and the Creation of the American Union, because in some sense, we take for granted that idea of citizenship, and yet, again, it is constructed. It's very different than what the Europeans thought of as citizenship, and we are very proud to have that difference. And it allows us to think differently about how society should work. And Doug unpacks a great deal of that and how the early Americans tried to deal with it. He's the winner of numerous grants and fellowships, as well as the author of numerous journal articles and book chapters beyond the book, and his edited volume, Early Modern Virginia, Reconsidering the Old Dominion, which was published as part of the 400th anniversary of the English founding of Jamestown. I'm going to keep it there because I want to hear from him. Please welcome Dr. Bradburn.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you all for coming out tonight to have this interesting conversation. I think it will be interesting, and it's been fun for me to think about George Washington in the context of immigration. I think David's right. It's not typically an area that we think about when we, George Washington, there he is on the dollar bill. George Washington is the father of a nation of immigrants. And I think we talk about him as the father of the nation, and we talk about a nation of immigrants. We rarely put those two together, but in fact, I think what I want to suggest is that that's the correct way to think about his relationship to the challenge of immigration. He was the father of a nation of immigrants. Now, at Mount Vernon, every 4th of July and every President's Day, we have a fantastic ceremony in which we have a naturalization ceremony where new citizens join the nation. I was really honored and I know Kurt has been honored to do this many times as well, but last July 4th to speak to 101 new citizens in the United States on the 4th of July on the east lawn of George Washington's house in Mount Vernon. They came from 42 different nations. And by the end of that ceremony, they were all fellow nationals. And it's really an incredible, magical transmogrification of these people who are foreigners into countrymen, countrywomen, with each other and with, of course, us. And right there at George Washington, the father of a nation of immigrants, it really is a meaningful and moving experience. So how can we think of him as a father of a nation of immigrants? Well, first of all, he's surrounded by immigrants his whole life. They are crucially important to him in a variety of ways. His mentors, Thomas and William Fairfax, are both born in England. Thomas Carlyle, who's a business partner and an in-law, is from Scotland, as were his early tutors. Of course, James Anderson is a man who he has helping run his estate, is the man that convinces him to start making whiskey. He's from Scotland, and he does that. Washington becomes one of the largest distillers in the country by his death. Some of the best generals of the American Revolution, I think of William Alexander, Baron von Steuben, the Marquis de Lafayette, are all foreign-born. Some of the worst generals in the American Revolution, Charles Lee, Horatio Gates, are foreign-born. Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who is, of course, a hip-hop star right now, is foreign-born as well. So 1/4 of Washington's cabinet was foreign-born. I don't know if any other president has had that ratio. Actually, Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury was he was Swiss. Albert Gallatin, the longest-serving Treasury Secretary. During Washington's president, the population of the two capitals, New York and Philadelphia, doubled in the 1790s, with 2/3 of that growth coming from international migration. At the time he was president, 1/3 of the people who lived in the state of Pennsylvania spoke German as their primary language. The House of Representatives during his presidency would have been a cacophony of accent of English, all sorts of different accents of English in a foreign-born group. And Washington himself was born in 1732, which was only 75 years after his immigrant ancestors came to North America. If you look at it today, that would be if a child born today in 2016, their immigrant ancestor, if they arrived in 1941, would be a similar length of time. Not exactly a long-tailed family as we think about it today. So I think Washington, in that sense, is part of a world filled with immigrants. Secondly, immigration was a matter of serious policy during his public life in a variety of different ways. His administration passed the first laws of naturalization, both called for in his annual messages. So in his State of the Union addresses, what he called for new laws relating to the naturalization of immigrants. The first in 1790, the second in 1795. The second, the standard length of time in which an immigrant would have to wait until they could become a citizen was 5 years, which is the same length of time that we have today. And it was, and I'll talk about in a little bit of how that came about. It was a compromise between two different views about immigration. And so let's look a little bit at that aspect of immigration policy in his world. First, I want to start with two strains of pro-immigration thinking that were crucial in his world, in the way that people thought about the challenges of immigration. And first, and for anyone who is divining policy of immigration, is an overwhelming belief in the economic benefits of immigration. That people added to a society were going to create wealth over the longer term. This is a relatively new in the 18th century notion of political economy, associated in North America, of course, with Benjamin Franklin, who discovers the rapid population growth of North America and thinks about why this is so crucial. But really the best explication of how many Americans believe this was important is in the Declaration of Independence. And you all know the Declaration, of course. It's the ringing terms at the beginning about why governments are formed and what you could do if you want to overthrow them, and all the things that King George III did wrong. And they're listed, this sequence of things that show that George III was a tyrant. And one of the things up at the top is an argument that he had prevented the easy naturalization of immigrants. So he has endeavored, quote, to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. Washington is very interested in this story, as Jack was mentioning. He's a surveyor, he's a speculator in land, he's a developer. He needs people, he needs migrants, and that's what that the colonies wanted. And so when King George is making it more difficult for migration to happen, it's an economic restraint on the future growth of that country. It's widely held in that way. And Washington experienced this very personally in his life. In the Shenandoah Valley, which was the western portion of Virginia at that time, it's filled with Pennsylvania Dutch, so German, Dunkers, Scots-Irish, Presbyterians, all sorts of people coming to a region and settling in the back areas that Washington wouldn't have been familiar with in Tidewater, Virginia, but understood that as they moved in, the values of lands increased and the security of those areas increased. So that's a very powerful pro-immigration aspect of thinking that's going to inform early naturalization laws in the United States. The other really strong pro-immigrant thinking that goes on really goes back to the notion of America as an asylum of liberty. The e pluribus unum, from many one, the notion that the American nation is drawn out of many differences, and differences that strengthen the country, particularly when it comes to religious freedom and the notion that America is a place for people to exercise the freedom of the right of conscience. Now, this becomes very prominent after the American Revolution in particular. And one of the phenomenons of Washington when he becomes president, a really unexpected phenomenon, is that they created in the Constitution this office in which all of a sudden you have one individual representing the nation. This didn't exist before the Constitution created the presidency, and it really wasn't looked for. But when Washington is making his way to be inaugurated, and when he's at the Capitol in New York at this time, he starts hearing from people all over the country, all sorts of different interests, business communities, voluntary associations, churches, synagogues, all different communities of difference throughout this large country who are all saying, congratulations, we're part of America too, and here's what we think the country's about. And particularly in those communities from Baptists to Presbyterians to Catholics to Anglicans And in Jewish communities, you're getting calls for and celebration of religious liberty. And Washington plays a crucial role, and this is before the First Amendment is passed, in defining what the nation's priorities will be when it comes to this sort of cultural difference. Famously, of course, there's a letter from the Touro Synagogue in Newport when Washington visits Rhode Island. Washington is really amazing at recognizing the importance of public opinion in the presidency and the importance that it will play in a representative institution. And so he's very responsive to this. He travels into all of the 13 states throughout his presidency to kind of hear what the people are saying. When he goes to Rhode Island, he gets a letter from the Touro Synagogue. And in his response to their letter of good wishes and support, he writes, quote, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of the inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." These sorts of sentiments you see circulated throughout the country in the newspapers. And in fact, internationally as well. One of the great aspects of my job at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon is the ability to continue to acquire materials from the 18th century. And one of our recent purchases is a letter written by Tom Paine. Tom Paine famously wrote Common Sense. He wrote The Rights of Man. He wrote this letter when he was serving as an assembly member in the National Assembly in France during the French Revolution, in which he quotes George Washington's letter to the Quakers because France is debating religious liberty during its own revolution. And he quotes this letter and sends it to a correspondent in England and says they should learn from this. And these letters are circulating in Europe, selling a notion of America as a land of liberty, a land freedom from with freedom from religious prosecution. And this is crucial in a Europe that is still dominated by state churches, which is still in the midst of religious wars, or barely out of religious wars, which has seen the Inquisition, it's seen all sorts of massacres in the name of religion. And so this policy of a notion not of a land of toleration, but a land of freedom, is a crucially exciting one in thinking about what America is and what the possibilities for immigrants might be. So that's the other kind of major pro-immigrant strain that's going to inform the way policymakers are thinking about what you do with immigrants who are coming to the United States of America and how you, or you don't, incorporate them. And these two really positive ideas, the economic positive benefit of immigration and the notion of America as a land of liberty, really inform that first naturalization law that's passed in 1790. Washington, as I said, calls for a law in his annual address, his State of the Union address. It's actually the second session of Congress that passes this first law. They could be excused for waiting until their second session. The first session created the executive branch, the judiciary branch, passed the first 12 amendments and created the customs system and the first taxes. So they got to naturalization in the next session. And that naturalization law is really extraordinary. An immigrant would have to wait for 2 years before they could become a citizen. They had to live in one place for a year. And essentially at any common law court of record, they show up with a character witness, they could become citizens. Now, by the standard of its time, and indeed it did only refer to white immigrants at the time. The context is Europe, and that's where they're thinking. But by any standard of the age, this is a remarkably liberal and extraordinarily progressive notion of how you create new citizens. But it was a standard that did not last. I mean, those very sort of positive notions were not the only things that would be informing immigration policy. And there are two other strains that would come out to change that law and make it quite distinctive. First, that it would be expensive to support indigent refugees. So the notion, there's an alternative notion. So on the one hand, immigrants will increase your economy unless they come impoverished and then they become a drain on society. This is another aspect that emerges in the 1790s. But more importantly, really, secondly, that too easy and open borders could subvert the national interest and become a danger and a threat to the very existence of the nation. Now, both of these problems emerged themselves in the 1790s because of the French Revolution. I mean, the French Revolution is a transformative world event, which overthrows this great old kingdom, the Ancien Regime in France, and really reaps havoc all over Europe as well. And one thing we know about wars is that they create refugees. Washington knew this from his experience in the American Revolution. One of the first crises he's had to deal with as commander-in-chief were refugees pouring out of Boston while he was trying to besiege the city and trying to figure out what to do with them. But the French Revolution unleashed an international refugee crisis on the young republic. You had not only immigrants coming from France, destitute in many cases, but you also had the Great Rebellion of Saint-Domingue, which would go on to become, of course, the independence of Haiti, the slave revolt. And you have lots of people showing up impoverished, fleeing slave revolt, and landing in the ports of America completely destitute. And one of the first federal policies related to refugee is passed during Washington's presidency, in which the Congress votes money and says the president can decide how best and how justly to give this money to these refugees. And in fact, that's one of the things that he would do. But the French Revolution also, more crucially, created a context in which America polarized. The political system completely polarized around what the right relationship of this new republic should be to this new republic in Europe. Is the French Republic just like the American Republic, and should it be supported, or is it something distinctive? And because the French Revolution became extremely violent, the radical tendencies of that revolution were seen as dangerous. And in fact, the French revolutionaries were overthrowing sister republics. They overthrew the Republic of Venice, which had been around since the 14th century. They had helped subvert some of the cantons of Switzerland. These are dangerous radicals from the eyes of many people in Washington's administration. There are a lot of radical sympathizers with the French Revolution being exiled from Britain and from Ireland and from Scotland. And guess where they were going? They were going to the United States, where they were becoming radical printers and producing lots of anti-administrative literature. So it quickly became apparent that ease of access to citizenship could become dangerous. If you're allowing everybody to become a citizen who arrives, then you're opening up the floodgates for a column within your state. And this becomes a crucial context that changes the naturalization policy in 1795. Now, so in the 1795 law is really a combination of those, the debates on it are fascinatingly prescient, because it's a combination of those pro-immigration sentiments, which have always been a part of what America is, and those anti-immigration sentiments, which are emerging from the international context of the moment. So the residency requirement changes from 2 years to 5 years. The witness requirement goes from you needed a witness for a good character to a witness of good moral character. Because a lot of the suspicion of these French radical immigrants and Irish and British immigrants is that they were atheists or deists or believe in nothing but revolution. All immigrants who wanted citizenship would also have to renounce titles to nobility. So there was, on the other side, a concern of all these French nobles coming from France who would then bolster the power of aristocracy in this new republic. And that was rejected. But all sides in this debate, and Washington, supported this next aspect of it, which was a more vigorous oath. So all immigrants, when they became citizens, would have to make an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and defend it, and that they absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to every foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty whatsoever, and particularly by the name of the prince, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is still an aspect of the oath that immigrants take. The oath all those immigrants took at Mount Vernon, they have to renounce their foreign potentates. And it's really remarkable. I've looked at this. If you look at any English-speaking nation and what they require of their new citizens, they don't require anything like this. There's no renunciation. There's no promise to defend the Constitution with arms. Canada, which of course shares many of the traditions of a nation of immigrants, requires nothing more than a mild oath to, quote, bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors. Australia, which has many sympathetic aspects related to the United States, has a rather feel-good pledge of which you just have to declare loyalty to the people of Australia, quote, whose democratic values I share. And if you look across the board of any English language country, you don't see anything like America. Now, what's happening in American context, and Washington's very much involved in this, is that it's not only a nation of immigrants in Washington time, it's a nation of expatriates. It's a nation of immigrants with an E. All the American revolutionaries renounced their allegiance to Britain, and they're requiring of these new citizens the same renunciation, the same revolutionary rejection of their former allegiance, their same declaration of independence before they could be seen as safe to be members of this revolutionary republic. And so that's something I want you to reflect on. That of all the nations of immigrants out there, America is distinctive in that way. And this challenge of immigration has been with us from the beginning. And Washington, an immigration policy is always pulled on multiple strains. Immigrants cannot be separated from international affairs, from economic policy, national security, or from that ongoing concern for rights and the desire of America to be a welcoming beacon of freedom to all the world. And Washington is the father of that nation of immigrants. Thank you.
As Doug suggests, the good part of all this is that we are a nation of immigrants. But it turns out that's a little tricky. It's a delicate thing, and it's a contested thing. And our history has throughout been immigration as an issue has been a contested part of our policy and politics. One of the people who's best to talk about that contestation is Professor George Sanchez, who is Vice Dean for Diversity and Strategic Initiatives within the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, and just a remarkably good scholar. He's an award-winning scholar of Chicano history and immigration who joined the college faculty in 1997. He's director of the center, the relatively new Center for Diversity and Democracy. He's the former director of a powerhouse department within the University, American Studies and Ethnicity. And he's a renowned mentor. And I think it's an important thing to remember. He's worked on a whole group of foundation grants and within the university, particularly with PhD students. He is an extraordinary mentor, and I've met a number of his students over the year. He's a former president of the American Studies Association, and he also serves as on the Minority Scholars Committee of the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association. If you have one book that you want to read about Los Angeles, the one book, one of the top 5, I'm sorry, I know a lot of historians, one of the top 5 I would put in it is George's Becoming Mexican American, it's a 1993 book, Becoming Mexican American, Ethnicity, Culture, and Identity in Chicano Los Angeles, 1900 to 1945. It's a brilliant book, just a standard in the field, and I can tell you, just amazingly illuminative about the place we live and the people who are here. We're all waiting for the next book, George, which is on that amazing place where Professor Sanchez was born, and that's Boyle Heights. And he's been working on it for a while. We've had little pieces that have made us all very excited, but we haven't quite got the book yet. He's also working on a number of other projects. Will you please join me in welcoming my colleague, George Sanchez.
David, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here, have this chance to talk with you. I've entitled my presentation to you tonight, Through the Eyes of Carla Martinez, because I wanted to let you think about how immigration history, immigration policy, and even George Washington himself might look when viewed through the lenses of one particular contemporary USC student. In my work as Vice Dean for Diversity at Dornsife College, few students have left as lasting an impression on me as Carla Martinez, currently in her senior year. One of my responsibilities as dean is to aid all students with special needs. And Carla came to me over a year ago as an undocumented student who wanted to benefit from the experience of study abroad. Carla is a very bright USC student, an extremely hard worker, indeed someone who worked 20 hours a week as a waitress at McKay's across the street. You may have been served by her at some point, while maintaining a very strong GPA. She had gotten into our Annenberg semester program in London and wanted to connect to the history and culture of Great Britain by experiencing it firsthand. However, her parents had brought her to this country without documents when she was an infant. Now she was a USC student with ambition and dreams, almost the epitome of a dreamer, wanting to do something that many of our students take for granted. There is a program through the Department of Homeland Security that can grant a visa to undocumented students for special educational activity, even though they do not publicize it. So we encouraged her to apply. Many of us wrote letters to our federal government to plead her case, including my former assistant who now heads the Immigrant Affairs Department of the City of Los Angeles. And this visa was granted to Carla. Locally, during last summer, Carla became something of a celebrity here in Los Angeles, appearing on all the local Spanish language television stations as the, quote, undocumented student who was going to study abroad. And during the fall term, Carla regularly sent us photos of her experience learning as she traveled without incident and returning to her family on our campus this semester to complete her final semester at the University of Southern California. Now, I wonder what George Washington, whose great-grandfather John immigrated to this continent from England, would make of Carla's story. But even more importantly for me, I wanted to connect Carla's story of ambition, struggle, and triumph to the history of Washington's administration and the establishment of the nation's first immigration policy in the 1790s. By limiting citizenship in the new nation to aliens who were, quote, free white males of, quote, good moral character, these British aliens and children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of aliens built into one of its first laws that contradictory relationship between character and biology that continues to mark our current debates. The all-white Congress of 1790 and President Washington also juxtaposed the issue of entry to the nation with who could become fully integrated as citizens of the nation. This policy clearly established that those who were not free, white, and male among them could not be full citizens, including the Native Americans who had been on this land before them, the black slaves that they, including Washington, owned and brought to this land in shackles, and the women that were their wives, daughters, mothers, and sisters, who would remain connected to the nation only through their families. Who could be a citizen and be made natural through naturalization, think about the word, would remain the major way the federal government influenced immigration for much of the 19th century, because the federal government had yet to try to limit or influence access to entry into the new nation. Indeed, state governments and seaport administrations continued to play the major role in this regard for decades after 1790. But the role of race and freedom would dominate the question of citizenship in the early republic, leading not only to the cataclysmic Civil War, but also to the critical questions surrounding who could be a U.S. citizen. At the conclusion of the Civil War, in an effort to ensure that freed slaves would be considered U.S. citizens, the Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, whose first sentence reads, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, end quote. Although U.S. citizenship had already been granted to free slaves by the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Congress felt it necessary to constitutionally enshrine this to reverse the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision of the Supreme Court, which had declared earlier before the Civil War that African Americans were not and could not become citizens of the U.S. Despite the fact that this amendment has recently come under attack by some anti-immigrant forces today, it has been a central pivot in immigration integration policy. Indeed, the one group specifically excluded from the amendment, Indians not taxed, would not become U.S. citizens until 1924. Other racialized immigrants, especially the Chinese, were specifically discussed in the Senate debate over this amendment, with some voting against the amendment because it would extend U.S. birthright citizenship to the children of Chinese immigrants. Mexicans, incorporated into the U.S. by virtue of the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846, had been explicitly integrated as citizens as formal white persons by the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, even though they would rarely be treated as whites in U.S. society. So the linkage of race, citizenship, and freedom would even be made more explicit symbolically by a gift from French designer Frédéric Bartholdi and the people of France in 1875 to commemorate the centennial of U.S. independence and specifically the abolition of slavery in the U.S. By the time funds were raised and the statue took its place in New York Harbor in 1886, those broken chains at her feet had been reduced in size and partly hidden by her robe. And the concept of liberty took a more generic meaning with the end of Reconstruction and the rise of a newfound white supremacy, linked to an emerging Jim Crow segregation. The time between the time it was first conceived and the time it was actually put into New York Harbor. I actually get to serve on the Statue of Liberty committee right now, building a new museum on Liberty Island, and that's quite a pleasure for me. But now European immigrants who began to enter New York Harbor in droves saw it call out to them. Emma Lazarus's 1883 sonnet, The New Colossus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," would only be added in 1903. Meanwhile, the federal government in the same period took the first steps in limiting entry to the United States at seaports by first targeting Chinese immigrants as a racialized group. Beginning with the 1875 Page Act that sought to prohibit Chinese women, all thought of as prostitutes at that time, Congress went on to pass a more widespread exclusion of all Chinese immigrants in 1882. Although Congress would eventually bar the diseased, the mentally deranged, paupers, and those likely to become a public charge, it's important to note that the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the first act of specific immigration restriction, and that it was done on a racial and not a national basis. And what I mean by that is that racialized Chinese coming from any country, not just from China, were barred from entry. Even if they were born in England or Germany, they were still barred because they were Chinese. Race and immigration restriction, therefore, were tied together as tightly as immigration integration and citizenship policy had been in 1790. Now, the turn of the 20th century, as the U.S. became a global power whose imperial reach extended far and wide, would witness the advent of eugenic racial science that would soon influence both immigration and integration policy. Members of various national groups attempted naturalization at a local level, since the process of becoming a citizen was processed by local courts and registrars. And in various locales, different decisions were made. To resolve these contradictions, cases went through the court system, sometimes ending up in the Supreme Court, to determine whether a particular group would be considered white in order to qualify for naturalization based on the 1790 Act, updated more recently by the Naturalization Act of 1906, which included only whites and blacks as eligible for citizenship. Groups as diverse as Armenians and Arabs were deemed white by the Supreme Court in the early 20th century, thereby allowing their members to successfully apply for naturalization as U.S. citizens. Tellingly, no group attempted to claim blackness. In 1922, Japanese-American businessman Takao Ozawa filed for U.S. citizenship, based both on the lightness of his skin and the content of his character. Associate Justice George Sutherland ruled that only Caucasians were white, and therefore the Japanese were unassimilable. Now, 3 months later, when Bhagat Singh Thind sought citizenship on the basis that the Caucasus region itself was in India, the court classified South Asians as Asiatic, outside the common understanding of whiteness, thereby stripping Thind of the citizenship he had been granted by a local court. He, by the way, in a very moving, committed suicide after writing a poem. These rulings had substantial economic costs to the affected groups. Indian landowners, for example, became subjects to California's alien land laws, prohibiting land purchases by, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship. The Immigration Act of 1917 created an Asiatic Barred Zone Act, extending exclusion of immigration from almost all of Asia. Racial science also separated the white races of Northern and Western Europe from the darker white races from Southern and Eastern Europe, legally creating quotas for admission in 1924 based on the US population of 1890, thereby severely curtailing Jewish, Italian, and Eastern European immigration to the US. The intent was to specifically ensure that new immigrants resembled racially the older stock of US residents, returning to the US to more Protestant and Anglo-Saxon origins, or as one frontrunner for the presidency today would say, making America great again. The 1924 Act also created the modern Border Patrol, as the US began for the first time to concentrate efforts in preventing surreptitious entry along land routes, not just restrictions at seaports. So in the period after 1924, managing immigration from the Western Hemisphere took on new meaning, even though there was no quota placed on immigration from that region. Earlier prohibitions against those, quote, likely to become a public charge were manipulated at the southern border to allow in those who could gain employment through the railroad network directly past immigration stations, while stopping as suspect women, children, and anyone who could not fill immediate labor needs of Southwestern employers in agriculture, mining, railroad work, or other industries. Meanwhile, those who circumvented immigration checkpoints along the land border were increasingly criminalized and racialized as illegal aliens, even if they had crossed this way for generations previously. In fact, in a stunning new book, historian Libby Garland shows how European Jewish immigrants who had been barred by quota after 1924 tried to surreptitiously cross the Mexican or Canadian border or sail from Cuba or engage in illegal crossing elsewhere, but also were able to evade the label illegal alien by virtue of an organized campaign to whitewash this form of entry in their histories. Instead, the label illegal alien came to represent something specific to Latinos, especially Mexicans, that would stick with them and grow through the 20th century. Now, I say that US federal and local officials tried to manage the southern border because their interest was not to stop migration or even undocumented entry, but rather to manage it in order to control the labor supply needs of the burgeoning industries of the growing Southwest. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s and jobs became scarce, no new law was implemented. Rather, federal officials simply made everyone likely to become a public charge at the border and initiated campaigns with local officials to deport and repatriate longstanding residents back to Mexico. In Los Angeles, this led to 1/3 of the Mexican-American community leaving in the early 1930s, with as many as 100,000 people sent to Mexico that were US-born citizens. The very meaning of US citizenship was not thought of as protective of one's individual rights due to race. So everyone was a target for repatriation, no matter what their citizenship status was. This form of second-class citizenship is also obvious in the history of Japanese-American internment during World War II, where 1/3 of those sent to camps were US-born citizens, incarcerated because of their race and not their loyalty or their character. Just as quickly during World War II, labor was needed. So the US government began the Bracero program, where Mexican laborers were now contracted to come north and fill immediate labor needs, but without the security of integration and official immigration. What began as a temporary wartime measure lasted until 1964, with over 6 million contracts signed between Mexican workers and the U.S. federal government, with the major beneficiary being U.S. employers, especially in agriculture. Deep, long-lasting ties of migration and economic exploitation were developed between rural Mexican villages and towns deep in the interior of Mexico and places of agricultural and urban employment well past the border with the United States. Management of labor meant that an Operation Wetback could be launched by U.S. officials to deport the undocumented at the very same time as the U.S. government was encouraging undocumented immigration by facilitating braceros to come north and unavoidably violate their contracts for better pay or conditions. These were happening at the very same time. I think one of our candidates spoke to these important, wanted these as models, Eisenhower models of what should be done now. When the Bracero program was finally ended in 1964, it was impossible to turn off this relationship. And undocumented migration soared once Mexico was put on a quota in 1965 for the first time. So the 1965 Immigration Act is usually put as part of the civil rights movement because it officially eliminated the national quota system instituted in 1924 and put in place equal hemispheric quotas, adding the Western Hemisphere for the first time. This act is seen as a continuation of the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act that, under the threat of comparison with communism, finally eliminated in total the 1790 Naturalization Act. It took till 1952 to do that, to do away with that had prohibited the naturalization of those who were not white or black. Moreover, it prioritized family reunification with U.S. residents and admitting skilled immigrants that the U.S. needed, not race and national heritage. Although, as historian Menai argues, these provisions were seen as non-racial ways to continue the dominance of European immigration at the time. Unexpectedly, what resulted from the 1965 Act was the total transformation of the legal U.S. immigrant stream. Before 1965, 90% of legal U.S. immigration had come from Europe, and after the 1965 Act was fully implemented, 2/3 of legal U.S. immigrants came from Latin America, Asia, or Africa. With Mexico for the first time under a national quota, but long-standing migration and economic ties still in place, undocumented immigration now came to dominate the flow from south to north. Estimated now to encompass as many as 11 million individuals living in the U.S. permanently, the undocumented have become an ever-present part of U.S. society. And Carla Martinez's family is but one of many that have contributed mightily to this society. This year, we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the last attempt to change the calculus of immigration policy in this country substantially. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA, passed and signed under the Reagan administration. That act, for the first time, fined employers for hiring undocumented workers, increased border security, and started a process of legalization for those without legal authorization to reside in the U.S. and set them on a path to U.S. citizenship. 10 years later, those legalized under IRCA had the opportunity to become U.S. citizens. And this led to an upsurge in Latino voting registration and strength, especially in California and Texas. Many, in fact, in California know that this was the complete change in why the Democratic Party has really dominated California politics since the late 1990s. But it did not stop undocumented migration. And the willingness to do anything constructive to address the issue has vanished from the U.S. political scene, leaving us in policy limbo for the past 30 years. What has replaced discussions of how to integrate immigrants successfully into U.S. society is increased racialized surveillance and criminalization of Latin American immigrants. We've seen the proliferation of detention centers and ICE raids, new technologies to militarize the border, and a growing presence of uncertain legality of existence, constant fear of deportation by many, and families that exist with members stretching from U.S. citizens by birth to legal residents to undocumented immigrants, all within the same family. These families speak to the new realities of liminal citizenship in cities like Los Angeles, where any semblance of normality now contains a constant fear that mama or papa may not return from work at the end of the day. I see students like this every day at USC, and one can only imagine how much more their presence is noted at public universities, especially at community colleges throughout the region. In many ways, their passion to succeed against all odds inspires me and pushes me to find new ways to support their efforts. In 2012, it was reported that white non-Hispanic births account for less than half of those taking place in the United States. And no amount of hand-wringing, revisionist racial calculus, or massive deportation campaigns will change the transformation of the US population that we are witnessing right now. George Washington set in motion a divide of the American population through immigrant integration and separation, legal distinctions, and naturalization policy that has continued for generations, even as it transformed over time. But individuals like Carla Martinez, to me, represent the true possibility for a new America, an imagined one in which civic participation and community commitment, not racial background or legal status, determines one's place in US society. Wanting to widen her perspective and understand the place of the US in the world took Carla last semester to study contemporary British society. At the end of this semester, she will graduate as a Trojan, and let us hope will be welcomed as a full-fledged member of the Trojan family that can make a difference in the world and help create this new nation that we so desperately need. Thank you.
We're going to have a little chat. I'm going to ask a few questions about the talks and raise some issues. And then I'm going to open it to you to ask questions and raise issues. I hope you'll think about it, what kinds of things you might be interested in hearing them talk about. It's an interesting thing because as historians, Doug and I are very familiar with many of the things that George talked about, and yet it's always this remarkable reminder of the good and bad of American history. And we need to unpack both to try and understand the meaning for our present and for our future from our perspective, both as historians and scholars. With that, I'd like to go back to Washington. And I have a couple of different things I want to talk about. The first is, do you think living surrounded, as you put it, by these immigrants all around him had some influence on him as a leader and as a politician?
Well, I think yes. I mean, he has an interesting trajectory away from the provincial throughout his life. He's unique in some ways in that regard, in which he, through his experiences first on the frontier and then in the American Revolution and then as president, he's trying to articulate a vision of a national community, not one that is local. And certainly in that national model, there's a vision of an expansive opportunity for white European types of all kinds. And I think that has to do with the different types of people he saw. I mean, as I said, he served, with so many different soldiers in the Revolution who were of different ethnicities. This is not the same experience of, say, a Patrick Henry, who was a localist and it was a Virginian and had a much narrower conception of community and interest. So Washington's experiences, I think, greatly expanded his views. I mean, when he was serving in the French and Indian War, he has a great letter in which he writes about all the people that live in the Shenandoah Valley, these German Dunkers, which are Baptists, and these Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, which he didn't like them at all. He loathed them. He thought they were awful people. But yet he says, but I will die for them. And I will serve and die for them. Because he recognized the pathos of the life they were living, that the loss of their children in Indian wars, the destruction of their communities, that he saw himself as serving a greater good, despite the fact that he didn't connect with them sort of, as a common people in any real sense. So, and that's as a young man. He's in his 20s. He's 24, 25, 26 years old. So I think you see this trajectory in him. I think you see it in race as well. I mean, he grows up at a time in Virginia where slavery exists everywhere in the world. It's the dominant form of labor throughout the Atlantic world, certainly in the plantation world that he's familiar with. It's illegal in Massachusetts and everywhere. He inherits the first slaves when he's 11 years old. And this is a man who, by the end of his lifetime, frees all the slaves that he owns in his will. This is something that no other president of the United States who held slaves did. And it's clearly through his awareness. He didn't have, there's no evidence of him articulating sort of a racialized view of humanity in the sense of that you see with Jefferson's writings, for instance, in the notes of the state of Virginia, of this, maybe there's a natural inferiority of people of African descent. Washington clearly doesn't believe that. But he believes that they need to be educated, and he provides in his will for the people that he frees to give pensions to them. But he certainly isn't able to bridge the gap into the 21st century in the way we think about race. So he's definitely influenced by the people around him and his experiences, and that's what makes him such an intriguing figure, I think. He is represented, from my perspective, of a modern moving person, of a progressive individual who's moving society into the realm of more and more liberty and not less and less. So,
do you want to add something, George? Okay. My second question is about this fascinating word that plays such a role in American history for all sorts of stuff. I've written a lot about hospitals, and there was a time when a hospital was a charitable institution for the poor, and you could be a patient if you had high moral character, and you couldn't if you didn't. I mean, it was, so character has this, it's not simply about naturalization, it's about our view of poverty, it's about our view of who's a worthy person, and at some level, there's that part of me that cringes every time I hear it, and yet at some level I understand it, right? Because there is this balance between indigency and dependency, and the independence of the American individual. A little bit, has it changed? How has it shifted from Washington's time to, I always am surprised by how often it comes up. Right now in the election, it's sort of come up again. Here we are in the 21st century. And yet, here we are again talking about who has the character to be an American.
I think it's one of those words that carries a very deep meaning. It's been judged in different ways. And it will, I think, continue to play a role in the issue of worthiness. Right? It's not only about becoming an American, that being part of the thing. It's about who can benefit, who can get, and for what purposes one receives benefits from the federal government, for example. We know that in welfare policy, worthiness has been a huge part of determining that. We know that in thinking about the responses to the Depression, people that crafted the New Deal thought a lot about the worthiness of people and whether that was something that would facilitate getting benefits or not. We know that some people who get lots of benefits because of, let's say, military service, World War II, the veterans, they may be the greatest generation, but they're also getting a lot of subsidy for housing in the post-World War II period, whereas others, for other times, may not be seen as worthy because they don't have that as part of their portfolio. I think about worthiness in relationship to how it changes in relationship to the crime, I'll put that in quotation, of illegality. right? So there was no such thing as an illegal alien before the 1920s. Historian May Nye has sort of talked about this, so that lots of people crossed surreptitiously before 1924. They cross in different ways. We can talk about the Irish. We can talk about a whole range of groups who did not have legal standing until that became an issue, right? And I remember a very local, the first immigration raid in the United States took place at the Plaza here in Los Angeles in 1931, where everyone who was stopped was asked for proof that they had entered the United States legally for the first time. Now, if you can imagine, most people didn't have driver's license, and most people didn't have wallets, right, at that time. So to be asked for proof of that issue was a completely new thing in 1931. But out of that, 12 people were deported. By the way, they were mostly Chinese or Japanese. And it became an issue proving their legal right to be in the United States. And that was for the very first time. And the whole concept of the illegal alien then became an issue of worthiness. It became eventually a misdemeanor to be in the country, and now it's become a felony. So you can criminalize surreptitious entry, but therefore you have to look at the late 20th century completely different than the mid-19th century, because in both cases people were entering without a legal right to move in. But the way in which that action is contemplated, right?
Why do you think, just to follow up for a second,
Yeah.
I mean, I know the geopolitical, I know that, but in some sense, why is it that is it that the United States becomes a different place in the 20th century and needs to do that? Or what do you think is driving that? Because I think it is an amazing shift, right?
Well, one issue is the growth of the government, so that the ability for the government to actually try to control.
They can do things
They can do
never
things.
did before. Yeah.
And that means that they can make things illegal that previously they had no capacity to judge, to monitor, to govern in any particular way.
Yeah, I mean, there's in the Alien Act in 1798, there's an effort to have all ship captains list everybody who comes in, and they can't do it. I mean, they don't have the capacity to keep these records, let alone stop people. I think this question about the deserving character of of potential citizens or refugees who are deserving. I mean, it's deeply entrenched in sort of notions of a deserving poor that goes back to charitable uses and who should be helped and who shouldn't be helped, and a lot of it's class-based. But it also has to do, in the early republic at least, it has to do with political ideas as well. Like when I note the difference between the 1790 naturalization law and the 1795 one, when they say you need to have a person of good character, a man of good character to a man of good moral character, that one word there is saying something about, they meant something about that. I think a lot of these terms end up being racialized, so that in the sense that they get applied to whole races. So an undeserving poor person would be indigent, slothful, and these are terms that get ascribed to races later on. I think it's much more complicated in the early period. I mean, there's a lot more fluidity in the meaning of race and citizenship that starts to get drained out. It's telling that the Dred Scott case declares that blacks can't be citizens. That's in the 1850s, and it's controversial in the sense that, what do you mean they can't be citizens? They've been citizens, So that, it's not. I don't think it's like a direct, clear line exactly. The boundaries are laid out, and as you get into the 20th century and you get into notions of eugenics and all these other ideals, it becomes a very dangerous and quite distinct world from the kind of early modern aspects. But yeah, that notion of deserving has been there, because if you're poor and lazy, why should you get money and support?
Yeah.
In the colonial American period, if you look at almshouses, most of the people receiving help are going to be war widows and their children. Because the notion is, well, they're deserving in the sense that their husbands died in these wars and they can't make a living, and they were temporary. This is temporary things. It's not, That this
Yeah,
would- and-
real briefly, I want you to talk, but real briefly, I've taught a class on social policy for a very long time, and I talk to my students about homelessness, and they go, oh yeah, it came about in the 1970s, right? Then I remind them of the walking poor in the 17th century, who were people who didn't have a home in a small village anywhere in the United States or in the colonial America, and they literally walked from place to place to place because they were homeless. And so there is this, there's this amazing sense, and they were, of course, viewed as very unworthy.
But
right?
I would put, and one little codicil as well, the states in the 19th century restricted movement of
Right.
paupers and free blacks and other types into their state. Now, I don't know how well that was enforced or not, but it was certainly a challenge for slaves who bought their freedom or who were emancipated, and they couldn't move
Couldn't
to
go
all these
anywhere.
states that are right next door to the state they were in. But also paupers. You couldn't move from Virginia to Ohio if you were a pauper, if you were going to be a charge on the local community. So again, who was enforcing it? But that was the law of the land.
So the one that I think is really telling is something that could bar you from entry to the United States beginning in the 1870s was whether you were likely to become a public charge. That's literally the LPC provision. So imagine the elasticity of that, right? And what it means that you're likely to become a public charge. Sometimes it was you had to have a certain amount of cash in your pocket. Sometimes it had to be somebody waiting for you on the other side. But it couldn't be a job because then you were contract labor, and that could prohibit you, right? At El Paso, that I studied very much in my first book, if you were a healthy male and there were railroad recruiters right behind the immigration inspectors, you weren't likely to become public charge because they knew that if they let you in, no matter what you had in your pocket, you'd get hired immediately. So nobody was likely to become public charge. Now, if you were a woman crossing, yes, then you were likely. You might be stopped. The Depression hits, that all shuts down. Everyone's likely to become public charge now. So that provision could be made incredibly elastic, and it could be determined by an inspector on the spot, right? So there's a lot of provisions in both immigration law, in particular, that are subject to a fairly robust interpretation that could go lots of different ways, and did go different ways in a lot of individual instances.
So one of the great things about having these two people here is that Doug wrote a book about the emergence of the concept of citizenship in the early American period. And in some sense, we've begun to talk about this through this language. The other book that I've already pointed out to you is George's book, Becoming a Mexican American. And one of the things that's, I think, fascinating about the whole issue of immigration is that, in some sense, we both have this very sharp divide. You're not an American, you are an American. And yet, at some level, we also have this long tradition of people becoming Americans. And you did it with Mexican immigrants and Mexicans, Native Americans here of Mexican descent. But I was curious to both of you: does that shift during this period? Are we becoming Americans? I think you would agree in the early American. And I'm not going to push you to come too close to the present because I don't want people throwing things at us. But I would encourage you, is that still okay at some level?
It's really hard to write about in a sense because, when I'm trying to define what citizenship is in the Revolutionary period, because you have the sort of the legal status of what it means to be a citizen. And then you have sort of identity, an American identity, and okay, well, what does it mean? Are you a member of the nation and the national, and what is the national, and the states are involved, and then you have ethnic communities trying to define what they mean. And that's the story. I think that's the really continuous, contested story is the law is over here, which says a lot, but then there's also the kind of cultural phenomenon of who can be considered an American. And that's, that's still open for discussion. I mean, that's the ongoing. See, the original title of my book was called "The Problem of Citizenship." Actually, I think the dissertation version. We came out because it's the problem that's created in a sense by the dynamic of by creating this republic in the revolution. Everybody can be subjects of a monarch, no matter what their ethnicity is, in a way. I mean, you know, Austro-Hungary Empire, I mean, you've got all kinds of diversity. Everybody can be subjects, and you can have all these different hierarchies. When you're starting to get, when you have citizens with power who represent a people that are sovereign, who's the people? And that's the problem that you've created when you created this new status. And that's why I think it's, you know, in a country that's dependent upon streams of immigration, and in many cases invited immigration, you're perpetually creating this problem.
I'll talk about another part of it, which I think often we're loath to talk about, and that's desire. Naturalization is something, is an action, right? You have to desire it. You have to take a step in that direction. Yep. And we often don't, it's hard to hear stories when it seems as if there's not desire, particularly for Americans, right? So I once got in a lot of trouble in Boston. I'll tell you exactly the story I told. Recent European immigration history really tells us that for most European immigrant groups, the majority of people who came to the United States went back to where they went, right? Mm-hmm. Italians, the majority of Italians who came to the United States didn't want to stay. They wanted to go back to Italy. Many people from many different countries in Europe, Swedes, that went back. Yeah. Okay, so what does it say when the majority of a particular ethnic group come to the United States and actually are not interested in citizenship? They're not interested in staying. They're interested in making money in order to go back and retain land or buy land or something, and they're successful in doing that, and then they return. They leave, okay? So I'm in Boston, I'm telling this story, and I'm saying, okay, so who does that leave us with? Well, it tends to leave us with the folks that aren't as successful, the folks that don't make a lot of money. And all of a sudden you say, you know, I can't really do what I wanted to do and go back to Italy and do this. I'm going to stay. And you meet somebody and you get married and you start to have kids, and then you're really going to stay, right? And then you decide, maybe I should become a citizen, all right? So rather than thinking of the process of naturalization as something that I'm coming to the U.S., I want to become a citizen, that's the first time, you know. Now, I say that in Boston, and I almost got my head chopped off, but the reality is that recent European immigration history really points in this direction, that the process of becoming an American is actually very tortured. In my own family, my mother and my father were two very different kinds of people in this regard. My mother grew up at the border at El Paso, Juarez, and when she got here, she immediately wanted to become a citizen and did. My father grew up in Guadalajara. He'd had a very different kind of history. He drove braceros. His father was a bracero. He got here, and he didn't want to give up his Mexican citizenship. Now, what got him to become a U.S. citizen was the Proposition 187 in California. Very late. He'd been there 30 years, and all of a sudden he said, wait a second, they're going to take away my rights. I may have a problem. Now I will apply for citizenship. Yeah. And it is what I called for the 1930s ambivalent Americanism. Right. It's, I'm going to protect myself, right? Yeah. And there's lots of histories of particular groups. Jamaicans in Boston, I'm thinking of Nancy Foner's work, that where people are becoming U.S. citizens so that they have a U.S. passport and can travel back much more easily. Not because there's issues here. So the meaning of why immigrants become citizens really has to be fleshed out, and it's not your typical history. So there's a lot of counter things going on, which I think is really important in the issue of desire. Why do people want to become U.S. citizens at different moments in time, and how does that affect their actions?
It's interesting you put it like that, because in fact, I think in the 1790 naturalization law, there's a strong ambivalence in the sense that they want to provide a clear-cut, uniform way that exists across the states. They can easily imagine people going back and forth. I mean, you know, because that's, you know, the world they're really of, going back and forth. There's not, I don't think, that assumption yet. It's when things start getting political and they start seeing, oh my God, all these French sailors have arrived and they're voting in that election and they're not, I mean, they start worrying that people are abusing citizenship, that they really start, you know, putting that aspect to it. But this notion of the losers are the ones that stay. I mean, that's very much early Virginia history, right? I mean, they want to go and make a ton of money and go back to England, and they end up having to eat each other in Jamestown. So they're,
So there's a
losers.
wonderful book by Nell Painter in which he has a chart that shows that many immigrant groups, actually 60, 70% of those, of the percentage came, went back. That's actually a lot more than people think. All right, so do we have questions from you? Yes, sir. There is a microphone, I believe. There's a young man coming your way.
First of all, I'd just like to compliment both the speakers. I thought it was really, really interesting, everything had to say. Two questions. One, for the first speaker, I was curious if you could talk about who some of Washington's big inspirations were, who were, some of his big influences. And then for the second speaker, I was curious what you think are some of or should the immigration process be shorter or longer, and what are some of the acceptable things to keep people out, or what if anything?
Thank you. Good question. I would say I'll focus on just one to be quick, because but George Washington of the immigrants that I was talking about that influenced him, there's a guy named William Fairfax who was really his brother Lawrence had married into this family. They were a wealthy family that controlled all the land between the Rappahannock River and the Potomac River, go all the way to West Virginia. And they represented sort of British high society. And William Fairfax had many sort of gifts of patronage in his control. But more importantly, he had a really nice library, and he knew how to behave. And these are all things Washington didn't really have in abundance. His own father had died when he was young. He didn't have a formal education. And he actually wrote to his brother that there's lots we can learn at Belvoir, at this man's plantation. And so this guy, William Fairfax, was someone that he drew upon and learned from, who was, an Englishman, essentially, living in Virginia. So that's one person that he learned kind of how to be a gentleman from.
I'll take your question a couple different ways. One is that, I do think that the United States has a right, as every nation, to determine how many immigrants they want. And the size of that pool, I think, is incredibly important, right, at different areas. Then the question is, once you've decided X number of immigrants should be legally allowed, how do you distinguish them? Do you prioritize people who already have family here? Do you prioritize skills that you want? I obviously would not advocate that it's based on race or it's based on other things, but there are things that I think that are important. I think you get into tougher situations in which you're trying to add on to that temporary situations or visas that, so for example, the majority, for a long time, the majority of people who are undocumented in the US come here with documents. What they do is they overstay visas. They overstay student visas, they overstay tourist visas, and that's usually a group that we don't talk about as undocumented. But that's the larger group of those that are undocumented in the US. Not the people who cross surreptitiously, but the people who actually cross very legally and then stay. And it's an interesting, group to kind of think about, right? It's sometimes our own students, right? How do we measure that? What do we do about that, right? They're already here, right? But it's not a group that's ever been focused on. So there's a lot of kind of complicated issues. For me, I think it's important to really rethink this in the context of a global world. One of the things that I think is very problematic in terms of US society, I think, by the way, we need to make sure that all immigrants can learn English. And we can't just mandate it. We actually have to open up English courses in community colleges and other places and make sure they're actually staffed. Right now, they're not. So we can mandate it, but if you can't actually go and learn English, if you're working 40 hours a week, how do we do it, right? So that's on one hand. On the other hand, we often are losing the multiple languages that immigrants bring to us. right? For a nation of immigrants, we have been so quick to try to push people to monolingualism in English that we've lost the richness of what they could possibly bring. And in a global society, that's critical. That's critical economically. So I'd like to have a society in which we absolutely try to make sure that all immigrants can learn English and at the same time keep their languages and learn others, right? Because that's going to benefit us economically in terms of a global economy. So these are things that I think are just not in the public discussion right now, right? I mean, we make assumptions about what immigrants are doing, and then we move in a kind of very knee-jerk reaction, and we should be talking about what do we need in the 21st century as an economy, as a nation, to really prosper, and then move in that direction with the policies that we have.
Others? Anna?
Hello, thank you both very much. I was listening about the different aspects of citizenship that I think you both spoke to. There's sort of this character part of it, and then also this place part of it. You sort of renounce your old place to accept this new place. And it made me think of how a lot of cities in the United States have sort of opened their arms to immigrants and immigration, particularly shrinking cities that sort of economically need the people. And how either now or over time, and you spoke to George Washington visiting the 13 colonies, having an effect on how he sort of started the country. How is that those difference in levels sort of changed our conception of citizenship and sort of formulated those aspects of what we conceive that to be?
I don't think I caught exactly the question in there. I do think that in the early republic, the local was so much more important in terms of people's sense of their belonging in the community. I mean, this whole dynamic between whether you're an American or whether you're a citizen of Massachusetts, that meant something that persists. I mean, it persists today, obviously, but...
Oh, can I push it a little bit?
Yeah.
I mean, it is this thing that we do immigration at the national level.
Yeah.
And yet, these are my students. We're going to go up to a classroom in a few minutes, and I was looking at plans that cities have. Detroit has one, Chicago has one, Dayton has one that popped right up. All of them are saying, we want immigrants. We want immigrants.
That's the Declaration of Independence.
These are
version,
all
right?
places that
We
have
want
lost
immigrants.
population.
Yeah.
And in some sense, the local and the national are still at tension, which is really what I think Anna's getting us at.
Yeah.
This idea that immigration, at one level, we have this yes, no, polarized debate. At another level, it's a complicated thing. As George suggests, the United States would love to have 100,000 more engineers starting new companies. They'd love to have 100,000 a million more entrepreneurs starting new businesses. And I got news for you. If you read the literature about Dayton or even Chicago, they would be very, very happy if those immigrants came there. And in some sense, I think that is one of our issues as a society that goes pretty far back. Is this the New Yorks and the Chicagos in 1900 really wanted the immigrants to come, but the south end of Illinois, forget it, right? I mean, so there's this debate at state and local levels as well.
There's a couple of pieces to it that I'll talk about. One is the absolute importance of birthright citizenship. And I don't ever want to take that for granted, that the U.S. has moved in that direction. That if you're born in the United States, you are actually a citizen of the United States. That is something we have decided for a long time. There are current proposals to do away with it. I want us to make sure that we talk about it because that has been a critical part of that. The fact that, if you're born here, you have that capacity. Lots of Europe does not have that. Japan does not have that. It is something that does distinguish us with a few other countries in that. And so I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that birthright citizenship is actually an incredibly important part of this, right? That has to be part of the discussion. There's interesting places to look at this issue. Actually, for me, one of the most fascinating places is Iowa right now. And you can see, you sometimes get little stories here and there because of the Iowa caucuses. But one of the things that I love studying Iowa for is that the children of farmers often want to leave, right? So you have farmers who
That's been true for a really long time.
really long time. They've come to Los Angeles, they've lived in Long Beach, they want to get out, they want to go to Chicago, they want to go somewhere else, right? So who's going to mind the farm? Who's going to mind the farm? Is farming going to stay part of Iowan culture, right? Well, who's often minding the farm these days are Mexican immigrants coming up. And there's a variety of local plans, particularly with towns that are losing population in Iowa, to try to get the transfer of the farm to the workers, who are often Mexican, because the kids don't want to stay, of those farmers. And so they need people who have farming expertise, who have worked the land, to stay and populate, right? And then you think about the rhetoric about immigration, and the caucus is happening, and you sort of realize there's something very counterintuitive in terms of what's going on in these Iowa towns. And you get that in a lot of agricultural communities these days, where the town is losing population, but the people moving in, willing to do the work, are immigrants themselves, right? I think those situations really have to be discussed, really have to be talked about, and we're literally talking about losing a particular kind of culture, right, of farming, of that kind of work, if we don't welcome immigrants. And many of these towns have come to that conclusion. We've got to do something here with the people who are right here doing the work. So for me, that's really interesting. Obviously, Detroit, obviously other places are sort of desperate for this. But I think about the desperation depends on your background, what part of your heritage you pull from, whether it's the immigrants will bring, because when I go every year, take a group of students to Japan. Japan's in a lot of trouble economically. Its population is decreasing. It doesn't have the youthful population in order to really sustain its economy. It's got a lot of problems, and it hesitates tremendously in trying to increase immigrants coming to Japan. It does not want to go in that direction because it thinks it hits at the core of its society. So it's in a dilemma. And I think we need to look at some of these other countries struggling with exactly this issue to look at what is positive about some of the heritage we have.
That's right. I mean, I think in Europe too, you get similar challenges of integration of immigrant groups over time. But that's the federal challenge of the United States. The Constitution gives Congress the right to make a uniform bill of naturalization. So why should Iowa be able to do whatever it wants? That's the federal challenge.
I'm still for the federal. I'm not giving it up.
You're a
but
states'
I
rights
still think
guy.
we could have a couple of talks about it.
Yeah.
The remarkable thing about George Washington is that he lived a really long time ago. And we can sit here now tonight and have a conversation about an issue that is front and center in our election, and we can't escape him. It's an amazing thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to welcome back Jack Knott.
There was one really interesting thing, Doug, that you said that affects me personally. My wife is from the UK, and she is not an American citizen. And the reason she's not an American citizen, she has a royal title given to her by the Queen. And to become one, she has to give it up, and she doesn't want to. So there we are.
What does she make you call you?
So these, not only nationally, but in very personal ways, if we start thinking about our own stories, we are affected by the era and the decisions and some of the things that George Washington did and how that played out, as George Sanchez is talking about. And I really, David, appreciate your questions and perspective on this and bringing this together. It's been very informative, and I hope you've enjoyed this. It's especially valuable to me in the sense that we're able to take something that's often not in the national immigration debate, an historical perspective an intellectual perspective, one that's nuanced and looks at these different dimensions and bring that into making our own situation more understandable. So I thank you all for coming in. Let's have one more round.